The dust swirled around Grace Everly's worn boots as she stood beneath the weathered awning of the trading post, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching a small leather satchel that contained everything she had left in this world. It was the summer of 1878, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Lone Pine, California, a small settlement nestled in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where desperate people came to trade, resupply, and sometimes disappear into the vast wilderness beyond. Grace had been standing there for nearly an hour, watching the few townspeople go about their business, her mind racing with possibilities that all seemed equally impossible. She was 6 months along, unmarried, and had been left behind by the man who had promised her the world before abandoning her at this desolate outpost 3 days prior. Her money was nearly gone, her prospects were non-existent, and the shame that society would heap upon her felt like a crushing weight added to the physical burden she already carried. The trading post owner, a gruff man named Samuel, who had taken pity on her and allowed her to sleep in his storage room for the past few nights, had made it clear this morning that his charity had limits. His wife was suspicious, and Grace understood without him having to say more. An unmarried pregnant woman was trouble, a stain on respectability, and no one wanted that kind of trouble lingering too long. She had been staring at the horizon, contemplating which direction to walk when her money finally ran out, when she heard boots approaching. Grace did not turn at first, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing her, but the footsteps slowed and then stopped. "Madam?" The voice was deep but gentle, carrying a hint of concern that made her finally turn her head. The man standing a respectful distance away was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore dusty trail clothes and a hat that had seen better days, and there was something in his expression that was neither judgmental nor pitying, just genuinely curious. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, probably not much older than her own 22 years. "I do not mean to intrude," he continued when she did not speak, "but I noticed you have been standing here quite a while. Are you waiting for someone?" Grace felt her throat tighten. She should tell him she was fine, that her husband would be along shortly, spin some lie that would preserve what little dignity she had left. But the exhaustion, the fear, and the bone-deep loneliness that had been her constant companion for weeks suddenly made deception feel like too much effort. "No," she said quietly, her voice rough from disuse. "I am not waiting for anyone." The cowboy shifted his weight, and she noticed he carried himself with a quiet confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin. "Are you traveling somewhere then? The stage does not come through until tomorrow afternoon." Grace looked back at the horizon, at the mountains in the distance and the endless expanse of sagebrush and alkali flats stretching in every other direction. She felt something break loose inside her chest, some final tether to pride or pretense, and when she answered, her voice was flat with exhausted honesty. "Nowhere," she said. "I am going nowhere." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with all the defeat and desperation she felt. She expected him to make his excuses and leave, to back away from the obviously troubled woman and her scandalous condition. Instead, he took a step closer, and when she glanced at him, she saw something in his face that looked like understanding. "My name is Fletcher Hayes," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "And if you will pardon my saying so, madam, nowhere is a hard place to get to from here." Despite everything, Grace felt the corner of her mouth twitch. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest she had come in weeks. "Grace Everly," she replied, because it seemed rude not to, and because something about this stranger made her want to hold on to the basic courtesies of human interaction. Fletcher Hayes turned his hat in his hands, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Everly, I do not know your circumstances, and I am not asking you to explain them, but I have been working a ranch about 15 miles north of here, and the family that owns it, the Morgans, they are good people. Mrs. Morgan, she is always looking for help with the household and the cooking, especially now that they have taken on more hands for the season. If you need work and a place to stay, I could ride back and ask them if they might consider taking you on." Grace stared at him, searching his face for any hint of ulterior motive, any suggestion that this offer came with strings attached. She had learned the hard way that men rarely helped women without expecting something in return. But Fletcher Hayes met her gaze steadily, and there was nothing in his expression but genuine concern. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me." "No, madam, I do not," Fletcher agreed. But I know what it looks like when someone is out of options, and I know that in country like this, we all need help sometimes. Besides, he added, settling his hat back on his head, Mrs. Morgan has been complaining for months about being the only woman on the ranch. She would probably thank me for bringing someone who could talk about something other than cattle and horses. Grace felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough over the past weeks, shed enough tears for the man who had betrayed her, for the future she had lost, for the impossible situation she found herself in. She did not want to cry in front of this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. "I am pregnant," she said bluntly, lifting her chin as if daring him to recoil. "Unmarried. If that changes your offer, I would rather know now." Fletcher Hayes was quiet for a moment, and Grace braced herself for the withdrawal, the sudden coolness that would enter his voice. Instead, he just nodded slowly. "I figured as much, madam, and no, it does not change anything. Mrs. Morgan is a Christian woman, in the truest sense, which means she believes in helping people who need it, not judging them for their troubles." Grace felt something unfurl in her chest, something that might have been hope if she allowed herself to feel it. "I have a little money," she said. "Not much, but I could pay for supplies if they agreed to let me stay. And I am a hard worker. I can cook and clean and sew. I would earn my keep." "I have no doubt of that," Fletcher said. "Listen, I need to pick up some supplies here at the trading post, and then I was planning to head back to the ranch. If you would like, you could ride with me. We could be there before dark, and you could meet the Morgans and see if it might work out. If it does not feel right, I will bring you back to town tomorrow. No obligations." Grace looked at him, at this cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere and offered her a lifeline when she had been certain she was drowning. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to protect herself. But those same instincts had failed her before, and more importantly, she did not have the luxury of caution anymore. She needed help, and Fletcher Hayes was offering it. "All right," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I accept your offer." "Fletcher," he corrected gently. "And you are welcome, Miss Everly. Let me get my supplies, and we will get on the road." While Fletcher conducted his business inside the trading post, Grace gathered her few belongings and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the baby. She was about to ride off into the wilderness with a complete stranger, trusting him to take her somewhere safe rather than somewhere dangerous. It was either the bravest or most foolish thing she had ever done, and she honestly could not tell which. Fletcher emerged from the trading post carrying a wooden crate filled with various goods, and Grace followed him around to the side where his horse was hitched. The animal was a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes, and it turned its head to regard her with mild interest as Fletcher secured the crate to his saddle. "Have you ridden much?" Fletcher asked, checking the straps. "Some," Grace admitted. "It has been a while, though." "Ranger here has an easy gait," Fletcher said, patting the horse's neck. "And I will keep us at a walk. The terrain can be rough in places." He mounted first, then reached down to help Grace up behind him. She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, feeling the callous strength of it as he pulled her up. She settled onto the horse behind the saddle, her satchel clutched in one hand, while the other instinctively went to Fletcher's shoulder to steady herself. "You will want to hold on," Fletcher said over his shoulder. "Do not worry about being improper. I would rather you be secure than fall off." Grace tentatively wrapped her arm around his waist, feeling awkward and intensely aware of the intimacy of the position. But as Ranger started forward with a gentle rolling motion, she found herself gripping tighter, grateful for the solid presence in front of her. They left Lone Pine behind, heading north along a dusty track that wound through the scrubland. The sun was still high, but beginning its slow descent toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Grace had been so consumed by her troubles that she had barely noticed the landscape, but now, pressed against Fletcher's back with nothing to do but observe, she found herself struck by the stark beauty of it all. "How long have you been in California?" Fletcher asked after they had ridden in silence for a while, his voice carrying easily over the steady clip-clop of Ranger's hooves. "About 4 months," Grace replied. "I came from Missouri. I thought there would be more opportunities out west." "There are opportunities," Fletcher said, "just not always the kind people expect." Grace heard the understanding in his tone and felt some of her tension ease. "And you? Are you from around here?" "Born in Texas," Fletcher said. "But I have been drifting for the past few years, working ranches wherever they would have me. Ended up at the Morgan place last fall, and decided to stay on. It is good land, good people. Do you plan to stay permanently? Fletcher was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about it. I have saved up a fair amount, and there is land available for homesteading if a man is willing to work for it. But ranching alone is hard, and I suppose I have not found a good enough reason to put down roots yet. There was something wistful in his voice, a loneliness that Grace recognized because it mirrored her own. They were both drifters in their own way, both searching for something they could not quite name. What about you? Fletcher asked. What were you planning to do before? He trailed off delicately, and Grace appreciated that he did not force her to speak the words. Before I ended up abandoned at a trading post, she finished for him, a bitter edge to her voice. I was supposed to be getting married. He was a salesman, very charming, very persuasive. He said we would go to San Francisco, that he had business prospects there, but his business prospects apparently did not include a pregnant wife, because he left me in Lone Pine and never came back. I am sorry, Fletcher said, and the simple sincerity of it made Grace's throat tighten again. So am I, she whispered. I thought I was being smart, choosing my own path instead of the one my family wanted for me. But I suppose I was just being foolish. You were not foolish for trusting someone, Fletcher said firmly. He was wrong for betraying that trust. There is a difference. Grace rested her forehead against Fletcher's back for just a moment, taking comfort in the steady warmth of him. Thank you for saying that. They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they moved away from the flat alkali plains and into more varied terrain. Sage and rabbit brush gave way to scattered juniper trees, and the ground became rockier, rising and falling in gentle swells. Fletcher pointed out landmarks as they went, explaining the geography with the easy knowledge of someone who had spent years reading the land. That peak there, that is Mount Williamson, he said, gesturing toward a massive mountain to the west. And those are the Inyo Mountains on the other side. The Morgan Ranch sits in the valley between, which means we get water from the snowmelt, makes for good grazing. It is beautiful, Grace said, and meant it. There was something about the vastness of the landscape that made her own problems feel smaller, more manageable. Or perhaps it was just easier to breathe out here, away from the judging eyes of town. As the sun sank lower, Fletcher guided Ranger up a long rise, and when they crested the top, Grace saw the ranch spread out below them. It was larger than she had expected, with a main house built of timber and stone, a substantial barn, several outbuildings, and a network of corrals and fencing. Cattle dotted the pastures, and she could see several figures moving about, tending to evening chores. That is the Morgan place, Fletcher said, and Grace heard the pride in his voice. Like I said, good people. The family consists of John Morgan, his wife Elizabeth, and their son Thomas, who is about 16. They have 4 ranch hands besides me, but they all bunk in the separate building there, on the east side. Grace felt her nervousness return as they descended toward the ranch. What if the Morgans took one look at her and refused? What if Fletcher had misjudged their willingness to help? She would be right back where she started, except now she would have to impose on Fletcher to take her back to town. As if sensing her anxiety, Fletcher said over his shoulder, "It is going to be all right, Miss Everly. Just be yourself." They rode into the ranch yard as the sun touched the tops of the western mountains, bathing everything in rich golden light. A woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron, and Grace saw her face light up when she spotted Fletcher. "Fletcher Hayes, you are back earlier than I expected," the woman called out. She was perhaps in her mid-40s, with dark hair streaked with gray, and a face that was lined with both work and laughter. Then her eyes moved to Grace, and her expression shifted to surprise and then concern. "And you have brought someone." Fletcher dismounted and then helped Grace down, his hand steadying her as her feet found solid ground. Her legs were shaky from the long ride, and she had to lock her knees to keep from swaying. "Mrs. Morgan, this is Miss Grace Everly," Fletcher said. "I met her in Lone Pine, and she is in need of work and lodging. I thought perhaps you might speak with her about the possibility of her helping around the house." Elizabeth Morgan came closer, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Grace's appearance, including her obvious pregnancy. But unlike the trading post owner's wife, there was no coldness in her assessment, only thoughtful consideration. "Miss Everly," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Welcome to the Morgan Ranch. You look exhausted, my dear. Why do not you come inside, and we can talk properly? Fletcher, would you let John know we have a guest?" "Yes, madam," Fletcher said, tipping his hat before leading Ranger toward the barn. Grace found herself following Elizabeth Morgan into the house, into a large kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke. It was a welcoming space, lived in and comfortable, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a long table that looked like it had hosted countless meals. "Sit, please," Elizabeth said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "You must be parched from the ride. Let me get you some water." Grace sank gratefully into the chair, setting her satchel at her feet. Elizabeth brought her a cup of cool water, and Grace drank it carefully, trying not to gulp it down despite her thirst. "Now then," Elizabeth said, sitting across from her with her hands folded on the table. "Fletcher said you are looking for work. Can you tell me a bit about yourself?" Grace met the older woman's eyes and made a decision. If she was going to be here, if there was any chance of this working, she needed to be honest. "I am 22 years old, unmarried, and 6 months pregnant," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I was abandoned in Lone Pine by the man who promised to marry me. I have some experience with cooking, cleaning, sewing, and general housekeeping. I will work hard for room and board, and I will not cause any trouble. But I understand if my situation makes me unsuitable." Elizabeth Morgan regarded her for a long moment, and Grace held her breath, waiting for the rejection. Instead, the older woman reached across the table and patted her hand. "My dear girl," she said gently, "we have all made mistakes, and we have all needed help at one time or another. The question is not whether your situation makes you unsuitable. The question is whether you are willing to work, and whether we can provide what you need. Can you cook for 6 hungry ranch hands and a growing boy who eats like he has a hollow leg?" Grace felt hope surge in her chest. "Yes, madam, I can cook just about anything." "Can you mend clothes that have been torn on barbed wire and worn through at the knees?" "Yes, madam." "Can you handle living in a place that is isolated, where the nearest town is a 2-hour ride and the work never really stops?" "Yes, madam," Grace said firmly. "I can handle it. I will handle it. I just need a chance." Elizabeth smiled, and it transformed her face, making her look years younger. "Then we will give you that chance, Miss Everly. We can offer you a room in the house, 3 meals a day, and a small wage. It will not be much, but it will be yours to save or spend as you see fit. In exchange, you will help me with the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and whatever else needs doing. When your time comes, we will make sure you have what you need. Does that sound acceptable?" Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them, relief washing over her in waves. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, that sounds more than acceptable. Thank you, Mrs. Morgan. You do not know what this means to me." "I think I do," Elizabeth said softly. "And please, call me Elizabeth. We do not stand much on formality around here." The sound of boots on the porch announced the arrival of the men, and Grace quickly wiped at her eyes. Elizabeth stood to greet her husband, a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face that broke into a warm smile when Elizabeth quietly explained the situation. John Morgan shook Grace's hand with a firm grip. "Welcome to the ranch, Miss Everly. Any friend of Fletcher's is welcome here, and any woman willing to help my wife is worth her weight in gold as far as I am concerned." Fletcher appeared in the doorway, and Grace caught his eye, mouthing a silent thank you. He nodded, the hint of a smile touching his lips, and Grace felt something shift inside her. This man, this stranger, had given her more than just a job. He had given her hope. The first weeks at the Morgan Ranch passed in a blur of activity for Grace. She woke each morning before dawn to help Elizabeth prepare breakfast for the men, learning the rhythm of ranch life through the daily rituals of feeding, cleaning, and preparing for the next day. The work was hard, harder than anything she had done before, but it was also satisfying in a way she had not expected. At the end of each day, she could see what she had accomplished, could measure her worth in the meals served and the clothes mended and the floors swept clean. The ranch hands were respectful, tipping their hats when they saw her, and speaking politely when they needed to communicate. Most of them were older, weathered men who had spent their lives working cattle, and they seemed to take her presence in stride. Thomas, the Morgan son, was shy around her at first, but he warmed up when he realized she did not mind his endless questions about everything from the baby to what Missouri was like. But it was Fletcher who Grace found herself watching, noticing in ways she told herself she should not. He was always nearby, it seemed, offering to carry heavy items before she could attempt them, making sure she had a chair when they all gathered for meals, checking in with quiet questions about how she was feeling. It was nothing improper, Nothing that anyone could comment on, but Grace felt the attention like a warm glow, a reminder that someone cared about her well-being. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Grace was sitting on the porch, taking a rare moment of rest and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and purple. The baby was active, rolling and kicking inside her, and she rested her hand on her belly, feeling the movement with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. In 3 months, more or less, she would have a child, a whole new person who would depend on her for everything. The thought was terrifying. "Mind if I join you?" Fletcher's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to see him standing at the base of the porch steps, hat in hand. "Please," Grace said, gesturing to the chair beside her. Fletcher settled into the chair with a slight groan, stretching out his long legs. "Long day," he said. "We were moving cattle to the upper pasture. Some of them were not inclined to cooperate. I made extra biscuits at breakfast for that reason," Grace said. "Elizabeth warned me you would all need the energy." "And they were appreciated," Fletcher assured her. "You have been a real asset around here, Grace. Elizabeth was telling John just yesterday that she does not know how she managed before you came." Grace felt pleasure at the compliment, but also a twinge of guilt. "I owe it all to you," she said quietly. "If you had not offered to bring me here, I do not know what I would have done." Fletcher turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "You would have figured something out. You are stronger than you think." "I do not feel strong," Grace admitted. "Most of the time, I feel scared and overwhelmed." "That is not weakness," Fletcher said. "That is being human, and if it helps, I think you are handling everything remarkably well." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light drain from the sky and the first stars begin to appear. Grace found herself intensely aware of Fletcher's presence beside her, of the way his profile looked etched against the darkening horizon, of how safe she felt in his company. "Can I ask you something?" Fletcher said eventually. "Of course. Do you ever regret coming west, knowing how things turned out?" Grace considered the question carefully. "A month ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. But now, I do not know. I regret trusting the wrong person. I regret the circumstances. But if I had stayed in Missouri, I would be married to the banker's son by now, living a life my parents chose for me, probably miserable. At least here, I get to choose. Even if my choices are limited, they are still mine." Fletcher nodded slowly. "I understand that. I left Texas because my father had my whole life planned out for me. He wanted me to take over his freight business, marry the daughter of his business partner, be someone I was not. So I left, and he has not spoken to me since. But I would rather be alone and free than surrounded by people and trapped." "Is that why you have not settled down?" Grace asked. "Because you are afraid it would mean giving up your freedom?" "Maybe," Fletcher admitted. "Or maybe I just have not found the right reason to stay in one place." He glanced at her, and even in the dim light, Grace could see something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. "What about you? Do you think you will stay here after the baby comes?" "I do not know where else I would go," Grace said honestly. "Elizabeth and John have been so kind. I cannot imagine leaving unless they ask me to." "They would not do that," Fletcher said with certainty. "You are part of this place now, whether you realize it or not." Grace felt the baby kick, a strong thump against her ribs, and she inhaled sharply. Fletcher noticed immediately, concern crossing his face. "Are you all right?" "Yes, just the baby moving," Grace said, rubbing the spot. "Getting stronger every day." "May I?" Fletcher asked hesitantly, and it took Grace a moment to realize he was asking if he could feel the movement. She should say no. It was far too intimate, too personal. But something in his expression, a wonder mixed with shyness, made her nod. Fletcher moved his chair closer and placed his hand carefully on her belly, his palm warm through the fabric of her dress. They waited in silence, and after a moment, the baby obliged with another solid kick. Fletcher's face broke into a grin of pure delight. "That is amazing," he breathed. "A whole person in there, just waiting to meet the world." "A whole person who likes to kick my ribs at inconvenient times," Grace said, but she was smiling too. Fletcher kept his hand there for another moment, and when he finally withdrew it, Grace felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. They looked at each other, and something passed between them, some unspoken acknowledgement of a connection that had been growing since the day they met. "Grace," Fletcher started, but whatever he was going to say was interrupted by the sound of the door opening behind them. "There you are," Elizabeth said, stepping onto the porch. "Grace, I was hoping you might help me with some planning for the fall. We always put up preserves this time of year, and I want to make sure we have enough jars. Fletcher, John was looking for you. Something about the fence in the south pasture." The moment broken, Fletcher stood and replaced his hat. "I will go find him. Good night, Grace." "Good night, Fletcher." As the summer progressed into early fall, Grace's belly grew rounder, and the connection between her and Fletcher grew stronger. They found excuses to be near each other, to share conversations over meals or in the evenings when the work was done. Fletcher taught her about the ranch, about reading the weather and understanding the cattle. Grace shared stories of her childhood, of the books she loved to read and the dreams she had once held. The other ranch hands noticed, of course. Grace caught them exchanging knowing looks, saw them elbow each other when Fletcher offered to help her with some task. But there was no malice in it, only a kind of amused approval. Even Elizabeth and John seemed to watch them with quiet satisfaction, though they said nothing directly. One afternoon in late September, Fletcher asked Grace if she would like to take a short walk. Elizabeth encouraged her to go, insisting that the exercise would be good for her, and Grace found herself strolling alongside Fletcher toward a grove of cottonwood trees that marked the edge of a small creek. "I wanted to show you something," Fletcher said as they reached the trees. The leaves were beginning to turn yellow, creating a canopy of gold overhead. "I have been thinking a lot lately about putting in a homestead claim. There is a parcel of land about a mile from here, good water access, decent soil. I went to look at it last week." "That sounds wonderful," Grace said, wondering why he was telling her this, why her heart was beating so fast. Fletcher stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression both nervous and determined. "Grace, I know the circumstances are not ideal. I know you have been through a terrible ordeal, and I know you are still recovering from that betrayal. But these past few months, getting to know you, watching you face everything with such courage and grace, I have come to care for you deeply. More than care for you, if I am being honest." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had known on some level that Fletcher's feelings mirrored her own, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "I am not asking you to make any decisions right now," Fletcher continued quickly, "but I wanted you to know that I am thinking about the future, a future that I would very much like to include you and your baby in, if you would be willing. I know the child is not mine by blood, but I would raise him or her as my own, love them as my own. I can promise you that." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of happiness rather than despair. "Fletcher," she whispered, "I care for you too. So much it scares me sometimes. But I have to be sure. I cannot make another mistake, not when I have a child to think about. I need to know this is real, that you truly want this and are not just acting out of some sense of obligation." Fletcher stepped closer, close enough that Grace could see the flecks of green in his blue eyes. "Grace, I promise you, this has nothing to do with obligation. I am falling in love with you. I think I started falling that first day in Lone Pine when you looked at me with such fierce honesty. I want to build a life with you. I want to be there when your baby is born. I want to give you both a home and a name and all the love I have in me, but only if that is what you want too." Grace reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I want that," she said. "I want that more than I can say. But can we take it slowly? Can we give ourselves time to be sure?" "We can take as much time as you need," Fletcher promised. "I am not going anywhere, Grace. I am here for as long as you will have me." The following weeks were some of the happiest Grace had ever known. She and Fletcher continued their conversations, but now there was an openness between them, an acknowledgement of their feelings that added depth to every interaction. Fletcher began spending his evenings teaching her about the land he hoped to claim, drawing maps in the dirt and describing the house he wanted to build. Grace shared her hopes for the future, her determination to be a good mother, her gratitude for the second chance she had been given. In early October, Elizabeth took Grace aside one morning after breakfast. "I can see how things are developing between you and Fletcher," she said gently. "And I just want you to know that John and I approve wholeheartedly. Fletcher is a good man, one of the best I have known, and you deserve happiness, my dear." "Thank you," Grace said, embracing the older woman. "You have all been so kind to me. I do not know how I can ever repay you. You already have. Elizabeth assured her. "You have brought life back into this house. And besides, I am looking forward to having a baby around again. It has been far too long." As Grace moved into her 7th month, then her 8th, the reality of the approaching birth became more immediate. Elizabeth helped her prepare, gathering supplies and linens, sharing her own experiences of childbirth with both honesty and reassurance. Fletcher became even more protective, hovering whenever Grace moved about, ready to catch her if she so much as swayed. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Grace teased him one evening when he leaped up to help her into a chair. "I know," Fletcher said, looking slightly sheepish, "but I cannot help it. The thought of anything happening to you—" Grace took his hand and held it against her cheek. "Nothing is going to happen to me. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "That does not mean I will not worry," Fletcher said, "especially since I love you so much." It was the first time he had said the words so plainly, without qualification or hesitation. Grace felt her heart expand in her chest. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for a while now. I was just afraid to admit it." Fletcher cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gently and reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "When the baby comes," Fletcher said, "and when you have had time to recover, I would like to marry you properly. I have already spoken to John about it, and he said there is a circuit preacher who comes through every few months. The next time he is here, if you are willing, I would like to make you my wife, officially." "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, Fletcher, I will marry you. I would be honored to be your wife." The contractions started on a cold November morning, 3 weeks before Grace had expected them. She had been helping Elizabeth in the kitchen when the first pain hit, sharp and unmistakable. Elizabeth took one look at her face and immediately took charge, sending Thomas to fetch John and issuing orders with calm efficiency. Fletcher was in the barn when Thomas found him, and he came running to the house, his face pale beneath his tan. "Grace," he called out as he burst through the door. "I am all right," Grace said, though another contraction made her gasp. "The baby is just coming a bit early." "What can I do?" Fletcher asked Elizabeth, looking desperate to help. "Keep John and the other men out of the house," Elizabeth said firmly. "This is women's work, and the last thing we need is a bunch of nervous men underfoot. Grace, let us get you to your room." The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. It was harder than Grace had imagined, the pain coming in waves that threatened to overwhelm her. But Elizabeth was there through all of it, coaching her, encouraging her, holding her hand when the pain was worst. And in the brief moments between contractions, Grace could hear Fletcher's voice outside the door, asking if she was all right, if there was anything he could do. Finally, as the moon rose over the mountains, Grace gave one last tremendous push, and suddenly there was a new sound in the room, the sharp, indignant wail of a newborn baby. "It is a boy," Elizabeth announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket and placing him in Grace's arms. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Grace looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and waving fists, and felt a love so fierce and immediate it took her breath away. He was perfect. Despite everything, despite all the pain and fear and uncertainty, she had created this perfect little person. "Can Fletcher come in?" Grace asked, looking up at Elizabeth. Elizabeth smiled and went to the door. A moment later, Fletcher entered, his eyes going immediately to Grace and the baby. He approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, and when he looked at the child in Grace's arms, his expression was one of pure wonder. "Grace, he is beautiful," Fletcher whispered. "Perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Grace asked. Fletcher nodded, unable to speak, and Grace carefully transferred the baby into his arms. Fletcher held the child with surprising confidence, cradling him close and looking down at him with an expression of absolute devotion. "Hello there, little one," Fletcher said softly. "Welcome to the world. I am Fletcher, and I am going to help your mama take care of you. I am going to love you and protect you and do my very best to be a good father to you." Grace felt tears on her cheeks again, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I was thinking we could name him Daniel," she said. "Daniel Fletcher Evans, if that is acceptable to you." Fletcher looked up at her, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Evans? It was my mother's maiden name," Grace explained. "I thought, until we are officially married, it would be appropriate. And then, when we do marry, if you would allow it, I would like him to have your name. Hayes. I would be honored. Fletcher said hoarsely. Daniel Fletcher Hayes. It is a good, strong name. Grace recovered quickly from the birth, her youth and general good health serving her well. Within a week, she was back on her feet, though Elizabeth insisted she take things slowly. Fletcher was a constant presence, helping with the baby whenever he could, changing diapers and walking the floor with Daniel when he cried at night. The other ranch hands took turns peeking in at the baby, their weathered faces softening with wonder at the tiny new life in their midst. The circuit preacher arrived in mid-December, riding up to the ranch on a cold afternoon with snow threatening in the clouds overhead. Fletcher had been watching for him for days, and when he finally arrived, Fletcher immediately approached him about performing a marriage ceremony. I would be delighted, the preacher, a kindly man named Reverend Thomas, said with a smile. Nothing makes me happier than joining two people in holy matrimony. The wedding took place 2 days later in the Morgans' front room, with Elizabeth and John serving as witnesses, and the ranch hands crowding in to watch. Grace wore a dress that Elizabeth had helped her alter from one of her own, a beautiful deep blue that brought out her eyes. Fletcher wore his best clothes, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. Daniel, swaddled in blankets, slept peacefully in Elizabeth's arms as Reverend Thomas led Fletcher and Grace through their vows. Grace looked into Fletcher's eyes as she promised to love, honor, and cherish him, and saw her own joy reflected back at her. When Fletcher promised to love and protect both her and Daniel, to be a faithful husband and father, his voice was strong and sure. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Thomas said with satisfaction. Fletcher, you may kiss your bride. Fletcher did so, thoroughly and tenderly, while the assembled group cheered and clapped. When they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning. Mrs. Hayes, Fletcher said, trying out the name. Mr. Hayes, Grace replied, loving the sound of it. The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt. Elizabeth had baked a cake, and John produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. The ranch hands took turns congratulating them, slapping Fletcher on the back and kissing Grace's cheek with awkward affection. Thomas beamed at them both, clearly thrilled to have witnessed such an event. As the evening wound down and people began to drift away, Fletcher and Grace found themselves alone on the porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket against the cold. Daniel was inside, being thoroughly spoiled by Elizabeth, who had declared herself the official grandmother and insisted on taking the baby for the night to give the newlyweds some privacy. I cannot believe this is real, Grace said, leaning against Fletcher's shoulder. 6 months ago, I was standing at that trading post, thinking my life was over. And now, I have a beautiful son and a husband I love more than I thought possible. You have given me everything I did not know I wanted, Fletcher said, wrapping his arm around her. A family, a purpose, a reason to build something permanent. I meant what I said in my vows, Grace. I am going to spend the rest of my life making you happy. You already make me happy, Grace said, just by being you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow begin to fall in soft, fat flakes that settled on the ground and the fence rails, turning the world white and clean. Grace thought about the long journey that had brought her here, about all the pain and fear and uncertainty. She thought about the man who had abandoned her and realized she felt nothing but pity for him now. He had missed out on knowing her, on loving her, on being part of the beautiful life she was building. What are you thinking about? Fletcher asked. How lucky I am, Grace said simply. How grateful I am that you asked me where I was going that day. And I am grateful you told me the truth, Fletcher said, even when that truth was nowhere. I am not going nowhere anymore, Grace said, turning to kiss him. I am exactly where I belong. Spring came early to the Owens Valley, melting the winter snow and painting the hillsides with wildflowers. Fletcher filed his homestead claim in March, and with John Morgan's help and blessing, began the work of building his own ranch. It was hard labor, cutting and hauling timber for the cabin, digging irrigation ditches, stringing fence line. But Fletcher approached it all with boundless energy, motivated by the knowledge that he was building something for his family. Grace divided her time between helping Elizabeth at the Morgan Ranch and preparing for the move to their own land. She sewed curtains for the windows Fletcher was installing, planned the layout of the kitchen, and dreamed about the garden she would plant. Daniel was growing rapidly, his personality emerging more each day, and Grace loved watching Fletcher interact with him, seeing the bond between father and son strengthen. By late May, the cabin was habitable, and Fletcher announced it was time to move in. The Morgans and the ranch hands all helped with the move, transporting Grace's few possessions and the furniture that John and Elizabeth insisted on gifting them as housewarming presents. "This land has been good to us," John said when Fletcher tried to refuse the generosity. "And you have been a good friend and a hard worker. Consider it our investment in your success." The cabin was small but well built, with one large main room that served as kitchen and living space, a separate bedroom, and a loft that would eventually be expanded for more children. Fletcher had built the furniture himself, simple but sturdy pieces that would last for years. Grace walked through the space, touching the walls, the table, the rocking chair by the fireplace, feeling the reality of it settle over her. This was her home, hers and Fletcher's and Daniel's. That first night in their own place, after Daniel had been put to bed and they had eaten a simple supper, Fletcher and Grace sat together on the porch, looking out at their land. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and somewhere in the distance they could hear cattle lowing. "I have been thinking," Fletcher said, "about expanding the herd next year. John said he would be willing to sell me some of his stock at a fair price, and I think we have enough grazing land to support maybe 30 head to start." "That sounds ambitious," Grace said, but she was smiling. She loved seeing Fletcher plan for the future, loved the confidence in his voice when he talked about building their ranch. "I want to give you and Daniel everything," Fletcher said. "I want this place to grow into something we can be proud of, something we can pass down to our children." "We will," Grace said with certainty. "I have no doubt we will succeed, Fletcher. Look at everything we have already accomplished." Fletcher pulled her close, and Grace rested her head on his shoulder, feeling utterly content. They sat there for a long time, watching the stars come out, listening to the night sounds of their land, and simply being together. The first year on the homestead was filled with challenges and triumphs. There were days when the work seemed endless, when the cattle broke through fences, or the irrigation ditch collapsed, or the roof leaked in a sudden rainstorm. But there were also days of pure joy, like when Grace's garden produced its first vegetables, or when Daniel took his first steps, or when Fletcher came home with 3 new calves and a grin of pride. Grace proved to be just as capable a rancher as Fletcher had hoped. She learned to milk cows and collect eggs from the chickens they had acquired. She could rope a calf when necessary, and was not afraid to get dirty. But she also maintained the home with care, keeping the cabin clean and welcoming, cooking meals that nourished them all, creating a haven of warmth and love in the midst of the hard work. They still rode to the Morgan Ranch regularly, Grace to visit with Elizabeth and Fletcher to help with the larger tasks that required more hands. The Morgans remained close friends, celebrating holidays together and supporting each other through difficulties. Daniel grew particularly attached to Thomas, who treated him like a little brother and patiently taught him about animals and the land. By Daniel's second birthday, Grace was pregnant again. She and Fletcher were both thrilled, though Fletcher became even more protective than he had been the first time. This pregnancy was easier, perhaps because Grace was stronger and healthier, perhaps because she was not carrying the weight of shame and fear alongside the physical burden. Their second son was born on a crisp October morning, arriving so quickly that Fletcher barely had time to fetch Elizabeth before Grace delivered him herself. They named him William Hayes, and he was every bit as perfect as his brother, though with lighter hair and his father's blue eyes. "2 boys," Fletcher said, holding William while Daniel peered curiously at his new brother. "2 strong, healthy boys. We are truly blessed, Grace." "We are," Grace agreed, her heart full to bursting. The years that followed established a rhythm to their lives. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, the herd increasing, the land becoming more productive. Fletcher proved to be an excellent rancher, respected by his neighbors and known for his fair dealings. Grace became known in the small community for her healing knowledge, learned from Elizabeth, and expanded through experience. People began to come to her when someone was sick or injured, trusting her gentle hands and practical wisdom. Daniel and William grew into strong, curious boys who loved the ranch and everything about it. Daniel had his mother's dark hair and serious demeanor, while William was lighter in coloring and temperament, always quick with a smile. They were best friends, inseparable and loyal to each other in the way of brothers. When Daniel was 5 and William was 3, Grace became pregnant again. This time, she felt different from the beginning, and Elizabeth confirmed her suspicion that she might be carrying a girl. Grace had not allowed herself to hope for a daughter, content with her sons, but the thought of a little girl to love and raise filled her with excitement. Their daughter was born in early spring, arriving with a lusty cry and a head full of dark hair. Grace held her and felt the same fierce love she had felt with her sons, but also something new, a connection that transcended words. "What should we name her?" Fletcher asked, gazing at his daughter with absolute adoration. "I was thinking Rose," Grace said. "Rose Elizabeth Hayes, after your mother and Elizabeth Morgan." Fletcher's eyes grew bright. He had not spoken much about his family in Texas, but Grace knew his mother had passed away when he was young. "My mother would have been honored," he said hoarsely, "and Elizabeth will be thrilled." Elizabeth was indeed thrilled, weeping with joy when they told her the baby's middle name. She became an even more frequent visitor to the Hayes homestead, delighting in little Rose and helping Grace navigate the challenges of raising a daughter. The homestead continued to prosper. By the time Daniel turned 10, the Hayes Ranch was well established, with a substantial herd, improved irrigation, and a reputation for quality livestock. Fletcher had expanded the cabin, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper front porch. They had acquired more chickens, some pigs, and even a few sheep that Grace sheared herself to spin wool for clothing. But more important than the material success was the life they had built together. The cabin was filled with laughter and love, with the sound of children playing and the warmth of family meals. Fletcher and Grace had grown together over the years, their love deepening from that initial spark of attraction into something solid and enduring. They still made time to sit together in the evenings after the children were asleep, still shared their dreams and fears, still found joy in each other's company. One evening in late summer, as they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a special meal, Fletcher stood and raised his glass of cider. "To my wife," he said, looking at Grace with eyes that still held the same wonder they had that first day in Lone Pine. "Grace, you have given me everything I could have hoped for, and more. You have made me a better man, a proud father, and the happiest husband alive. I love you more today than I did 10 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Grace felt tears of happiness on her cheeks. "And I love you, Fletcher Hayes. Thank you for stopping to ask a desperate woman where she was going. Thank you for seeing past my circumstances to who I really was. Thank you for giving me this beautiful life." They kissed while their children cheered, Daniel and William pretending to be grossed out, while Rose clapped her small hands with delight. That night, after the children were asleep, Fletcher and Grace lay in bed, talking about the future. Rose would need a proper education, and they were discussing the possibility of hiring a teacher or sending her to the school that had recently opened in Lone Pine. Daniel was showing an interest in horses and wanted to learn to break and train them. William had declared he wanted to be a rancher like his father and never leave the homestead. "Do you ever think about that day at the trading post?" Fletcher asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Grace's arm. "Sometimes," Grace admitted. "But it feels like a different lifetime now, like it happened to someone else. That woman was so lost, so afraid. I barely recognize her anymore. She was brave," Fletcher said. "Braver than she knew, and she became this incredible woman I have the privilege of calling my wife." Grace turned to face him, studying his features in the moonlight that streamed through the window. There were lines around his eyes now, silver threading through his hair at the temples, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. "I think we should have another baby," she said suddenly. Fletcher's eyebrows shot up. "Another? Grace? We have 3 already, and Rose is only 4. "I know," Grace said, "but I love our family. I love watching them grow and learn, and I think we have room for one more." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "You know, I can never refuse you anything. If you want another baby, then we will have another baby. Our home certainly has enough love for one more." Their 4th child, a boy they named Matthew, was born the following spring. He was a calm, content baby who rarely cried and seemed perfectly happy to watch the world go by. The older children adored him, each taking turns helping to care for him and playing with him. Life settled into a new rhythm with 4 children. The homestead required even more work, but there were also more hands to help, as Daniel and William grew old enough to take on real responsibilities. Grace had never been happier, surrounded by the family she had built, working alongside the man she loved, seeing the results of their efforts in the thriving ranch around them. When Matthew was 2 years old, Elizabeth Morgan passed away peacefully in her sleep. The loss hit Grace hard, as Elizabeth had been both mentor and friend, the mother figure she had needed when she first arrived in California. The entire community turned out for the funeral, testament to how much Elizabeth had been loved. John Morgan, grief-stricken but grateful for his long marriage, decided to sell the ranch and move to San Francisco to live with his sister. Thomas, now a grown man with a family of his own, bought a portion of the land, while Fletcher purchased the rest, effectively doubling the size of the Hayes ranch. Elizabeth would have been happy to know the land stayed in the family, John said, as they finalized the arrangements. You and Grace, you are family to us, always have been. The expansion brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. Fletcher hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload, and Daniel, now a capable young man of 17, took on more responsibilities. He had inherited his mother's thoughtful nature and his father's work ethic, and Fletcher began to talk about leaving the ranch to him someday. Grace found herself with more time as the children grew older and more independent. She expanded her healing work, often riding out to help families in the area with illnesses or injuries. She also began teaching Rose to read and write, determined that her daughter would have every advantage. One autumn evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Daniel announced that he had been corresponding with a young woman from Lone Pine, the daughter of the new trading post owner. Her name is Sarah, he said, his ears turning red as everyone stared at him. I met her when I went to pick up supplies last month. She is smart and kind, and I would like to court her properly if you and Ma approve. Fletcher and Grace exchanged glances, both remembering when they had been young and falling in love. Of course we approve, Grace said warmly. We would love to meet her. The courtship progressed quickly, and within 6 months, Daniel and Sarah were married in a ceremony at the Hayes homestead. Grace watched her eldest son pledge his love to his new wife and felt the circle of life completing itself. She was no longer the desperate pregnant woman at the trading post. She was a mother watching her child begin his own journey, secure in the knowledge that she had given him a foundation of love and values to build upon. Sarah proved to be a wonderful addition to the family, fitting seamlessly into the rhythm of ranch life. She and Rose became particularly close, and Sarah began helping Grace with her healing work, showing a natural aptitude for it. As the years continued to pass, the Hayes family continued to grow and thrive. William fell in love with a rancher's daughter from the neighboring valley, and they married when he was 21. Rose, spirited and independent, declared she wanted to be a teacher and eventually opened a small school on the Hayes property, teaching the children of ranch families in the area. Matthew, the youngest, showed an unexpected talent for music, teaching himself to play the harmonica and later a fiddle that Fletcher bought for him. His music became the soundtrack to family gatherings, filling the homestead with joy and laughter. Fletcher and Grace watched it all unfold, their love for each other only growing stronger with time. They had built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of love and family that would continue for generations. On the morning of their 25th wedding anniversary, Grace woke to find Fletcher already awake, watching her with a soft smile. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, much as she had so many times before. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Fletcher said. "I am thinking about that day in Lone Pine when I saw a woman who needed help and decided to offer it. I had no idea that decision would change my life so completely." "I am the lucky one," Grace said, reaching up to touch his face. "You saved me, Fletcher. You and your belief that I was worth saving." "You saved yourself," Fletcher corrected gently. "You had the courage to accept help, to trust again, to build a new life. I just had the privilege of being there to support you." They rose and dressed, preparing for the celebration their children had planned. The entire family would be gathering, including 8 grandchildren now, for a feast and festivities. As Grace moved through her home, the home Fletcher had built with his own hands, she felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. The celebration was everything they could have hoped for. The grandchildren ran wild with excitement. The food was abundant and delicious, and the love in the air was palpable. As the sun began to set, casting its golden light over the land, Daniel stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled family. "You have shown us what true love looks like, what commitment means, what it takes to build something lasting. Because of you, we all know what a real home feels like, what it means to be part of a family. Thank you for everything you have given us, for every sacrifice you made, for every lesson you taught. We love you both more than words can say." Everyone raised their glasses, and Grace felt Fletcher's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently. She looked around at the faces of her children and grandchildren, at the home she had built, at the life she had created, and knew that she had found her true home all those years ago when she had stood at that trading post and said she was going nowhere. But she had not gone nowhere. She had gone everywhere that mattered. She had gone to love and family and purpose and joy. She had gone from desperation to hope, from fear to confidence, from loneliness to belonging. As the party continued into the evening, Fletcher and Grace slipped away for a few moments alone. They walked hand in hand to the place where their cabin had first stood, now marked by a simple stone marker they had placed to remember their beginnings. "We did well, did we not?" Fletcher said, looking out over the ranch that had grown from nothing. "We did," Grace agreed. "We took a chance on each other, and we built something beautiful." Fletcher turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Hayes, I want you to know that I would do it all again, exactly the same way. Every hardship, every challenge, every moment of doubt, it was all worth it to have this life with you. And I would stand at that trading post again, lost and afraid, knowing it would lead me to you," Grace said. "You are my home, Fletcher. You always have been." They kissed as the sun set behind them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would endure beyond their own lifetimes, passed down through the children and grandchildren they had raised together. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joys and sorrows as life always does. Fletcher's hair turned completely gray, then white, and Grace's face showed the lines of a life well lived. But their love never wavered, never diminished. They remained each other's best friend, strongest supporter, and greatest love. When Fletcher was 72, he suffered a bad fall from his horse. The injury was serious, and for a time, the family feared they might lose him. But with Grace by his side every moment, nursing him with the same capable hands that had delivered calves and mended fence posts and held countless babies, Fletcher recovered, though he never regained his full strength. "I am getting old," he told Grace one evening as they sat in their favorite spot on the porch, a blanket tucked around them against the autumn chill. "We are getting old together," Grace corrected, "and I would not have it any other way." "Do you ever have regrets?" Fletcher asked. "About the life you might have had if things had gone differently?" Grace thought about the question seriously, as she always did when Fletcher asked something important. "No," she said finally, "not a single regret. Every choice I made, every path I took, led me here, to this life with you. How could I regret that?" They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The ranch was thriving under Daniel's management now, with William as his partner and Matthew helping with the business side of things. Rose lived nearby with her husband and children, teaching and continuing Grace's healing work. "We did good, Grace," Fletcher said softly. "We took our chance at happiness and made the most of it." "We did," Grace agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We really did." Fletcher Hayes passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, surrounded by his family. Grace held his hand as he slipped away, whispering words of love and gratitude for the life they had shared. The grief was profound, a loss that cut to the very core of her being. But even in her sorrow, Grace felt grateful. They had been given more than 4 decades together, decades filled with love and laughter and purpose. At Fletcher's funeral, attended by what seemed like half the county, Grace stood with quiet dignity, supported by her children. As she looked at the faces gathered to honor her husband, she saw the impact he had made, the lives he had touched. But more than that, she saw the legacy they had built together in the faces of their children and grandchildren. After the funeral, as the family gathered back at the ranch, Grace walked alone to the spot where she and Fletcher had stood so many times over the years. She could almost feel his presence beside her, could almost hear his voice saying her name the way he always had, with such love and tenderness. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, to the land, to the memory of the man who had changed her life. "Thank you for stopping that day, for asking where I was going, for being patient when I said nowhere. Thank you for showing me that nowhere could become somewhere, that loss could become found, that a desperate pregnant woman at a trading post could become someone loved and cherished." Grace lived for another 8 years after Fletcher's death, surrounded by her family, continuing her healing work and tending the ranch that had been their shared dream. She told stories of Fletcher to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, making sure they knew the man who had built their family's foundation. When Grace Everly Hayes passed away at the age of 84, she was laid to rest beside her husband, their graves marked by simple headstones that read simply their names and dates, and beneath, "Together Forever." The ranch passed to Daniel and his descendants, but everyone in the family understood they were merely caretakers of Fletcher and Grace's legacy. Years later, one of Grace's great-granddaughters, researching the family history, found an old journal Grace had kept during her first years on the homestead. In it, she found an entry dated December 1878, just days after Grace and Fletcher's wedding. "I thought my life was over when I stood at that trading post," Grace had written in her careful script. "I thought I was going nowhere, that I had nowhere to go. But I was wrong. I was going everywhere I needed to be. I was going home, though I did not know it yet. Fletcher asked me where I was going, and I said nowhere. But nowhere led me to everywhere. Nowhere led me to love, to family, to purpose, to joy. Nowhere led me to exactly where I belonged. And for that, I will be grateful for the rest of my days." The great-granddaughter closed the journal carefully, tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what her great-grandmother had written. A chance meeting, a simple question, and an honest answer had set in motion a love story that had spanned decades and touched countless lives. The Hayes family still ranches that same land today, still tells the story of Fletcher and Grace, the cowboy and the pregnant woman at the trading post who found each other when both needed it most, and built a legacy of love that endures long after they are gone. Their story has become family legend, passed down through generations, as a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that nowhere can become somewhere when you find the right person to share the journey. And on quiet evenings when the sunset paints the mountains gold and the wind whispers through the cottonwoods, some say you can still feel their presence there, two souls who found each other against all odds and loved each other across a lifetime, their love story written into the very land they cherished and the family they created together.